Hello, everybody. My name is Peter Strautiņš. I'm an economist for Luminor, also stage performer, talking head, and sometimes also entertainer on serious subjects. So today we are speaking about serious subject, how to save the world. In the current war for saving the world, probably the most important frontline is the frontline of the hot war in Ukraine. That was just discussed by Alexei Arestovich and other speakers in the previous panel. But there is also another frontline which is also very important, and actions on this front helps the good guys on the other one. So a lot of economic pressure is being applied on Russia and its allies to stop what they are doing. Not totally successful so far, but there are definitely results as we see that both Russian economy and military are being affected by these sanctions. If there is conventional wisdom in media and academic world about economic sanctions, I think I could summarize it as that these sanctions are typically not really very effective. But so far, in this case, perhaps we are the good guys. We are the good guys, of course. We are doing progress. There are some numbers coming out of Russia that kind of confirms that. And here in this discussion, we have great opportunity to gain new insights about that, as we have one of current global leading practitioners of economic sanctions, Mr. Valdis Dombrovskis, Vice President of the European Commission, one of generals in economic war. We have Ana Palacio, the Foreign Minister of Spain, with great experience in matters of war and peace. And we have two leading theoreticians of economic sanctions and global economy, Ms. Maria Shagina and Mr. Funk Kirkegaard. So let me ask first Mr. Dombrovskis. Maybe you can very briefly summarize the actions taken in economic war so far by Europe, by its allies, and how do you see prospects in near term? How can we advance in this fight?
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Well, first of all, I would like to thank the organizers of Riga conference for this possibility to be here and have this discussion. Well, indeed, since Russia's invasion in Ukraine, we are working in two directions. One is to provide all necessary support to Ukraine, and second is to put pressure on aggressor, Russia, also Belarus, in form of sanctions. So all in all, by now we have adopted 8 sanctions packages as a European Union, and we have done so in close coordination with our international partners. And those sanctions cover, I would say, a broad range of issues. Well, first of all, there are personal sanctions against Russia's high-level officials, starting with Putin himself and with Russia's oligarchs. Then there are economic sanctions, including export bans of a number of sensitive technologies, so military technologies, dual-use technologies, high-tech, so export controls. There are sanctions regarding the transport, including air and maritime transport. There are obviously sanctions in the sector of energy, because energy is main source of budgetary revenue for Russia. So we have nearly complete oil embargo we have prohibition of imports of Russian coal, and are rapidly phasing out our dependence on Russian gas, so have decreased imports very substantially. So in any case, the strategic direction is clear. We were moving away from Russia's fossil fuels. And we are in coordination, for example, with G7. We are working now on introduction of price cap for Russian oil, which is additional element to significantly reduce Russia's ability to wage this war. If we look at the economic implications, we see both current account and budgetary surpluses on Russia rapidly going down, and according to the IMF forecast, Russia is expected to be in recession both this year and next. And we see a number of sectors basically collapsing. Like, for example, car production in Russia is now 90% down, and one could give many other examples like this.
And maybe you could just very briefly elaborate how do you think how this price cap can be really applied, how market participants can be forced to buy something below market price. Do you think it will work? There are doubts about that, that's why I'm asking.
Well, first of all, it's G7 price cap, so I would say there's a strong international coalition behind this to enforce this price cap. Different players will have probably different instruments to deal with, including possibly through secondary sanctions. And as regards EU, how we prepared ourselves for implementation of this price cap is the prohibition of of EU shipping operators and insurers to ship and insure Russia's oil shipments as long as they do not comply with the price cap. Because as regards EU itself, it's already oil embargo. And as regards deliveries to the third countries, there will be this prohibition, or rather it's like exemption from existing prohibition only for those shipments which do comply with the price cap. And in any case, we already now see that Russia is selling its oil at a substantial discount to compare with international market prices. It had to reorient its supplies to countries like China, like India, but they are doing it at a heavy discount, and we expect that, so to say, probably regardless of the specific rhetorics, at the end of the day, the price will be within the price cap set by G7.
Okay. Now I would like to ask Dr. Maria Shagina, how do you think, how has the sanctions policy performed so far? Has it been more successful than you expected? Does it perform well comparing to historical precedents? How do you think how it could work in the future?
Good afternoon. Happy to join you online from Berlin. It's indeed the most asked question, how effective sanctions have been, and that comes down to your expectations and also the objective of sanctions. Right, we have the objective of sanctions, which is much more moderate than in comparison with 2014. It's no longer about the behavioral change. This time is about eroding Russia's ability to fund the war, and it's by constraining Russia's capabilities technologically, but also financially, as was pointed out earlier. The type of sanctions that have been imposed will, over a long run, constrain Russia's abilities to wage this war. The short-term impact is less than expected. Indeed, IMF is reducing the contraction of the Russian GDP, and now from -6, I think -3.5% of GDP. But I think the long-term picture is rather bleak for the Russian economy. By 2030, the Russian economy will contract by 20%, and we are looking at a country that will be much more isolated and inward-looking. As it was pointed out, the earlier signs of the impact of sanctions have been seen in the car industry, aviation industry, that basically came to a halt, and that will accumulate over time. So for Russia is the big task how to come up with a new economic model and to leapfrog from that degradation that is currently ongoing, or reverse industrialization, as the Central Bank of Russia named it, to some sort of modernization or the survival strategy. And that will be the key, because ultimately in the transforming world, the globalization is changing and everyone needs friends. So Russia is very short on friends, and it's pivoting to those pariah states that Russia has become itself, is Iran, North Korea, to source equipment that it can't procure anymore. And also we see that China isn't really rushing in to help Russia. And that is an indication of their so-called no-limit partnership, that Beijing is very risk-averse to help Russia where there are secondary sanctions risk. And now the US is expanding primary sanctions, not necessarily calling for secondary sanctions, but there are more and more areas where Beijing would be thinking twice whether to engage with Russia or not. And the price cap that was pointed out earlier will be that litmus test for both China and India, whether to help Russia. So far, both countries have capitalized on Russia's isolation, and that was also the case in 2014. But whether they will be happy to risk their insurance, their maritime companies, to be at the risk of being sanctioned is a big question mark.
Thank you. So perhaps the most useful effect of sanctions and immediately important might be a negative impact on military-industrial complex of Russia. Do you see that happening? Prospects for that? Any thoughts?
Absolutely. So in line with the core and aviation industry, we're seeing incremental impact on the defense industry. And the main weakness here, the main vulnerability for the Russian economy is that it can't be self-sufficient in terms of producing chips, semiconductors. No country can be, for a matter of fact. So sourcing them either through illicit procurement network or pivoting to countries that didn't join the quite broad export controls that the US and allies have designed will be quite time-consuming, more expensive, and you also can't do this on mass production. The US has recently issued the leaflet of the impact of the export controls and sanctions on Russia's defense sector, and there are quite a few examples that companies can't keep up with production lines, that anything that is produced doesn't necessarily work in the sense with good quality. So there is a lot of malfunctioning. For example, 40% of any Chinese chips that have been delivered with consumer goods are now being defect and are not operating. So more and more of that will come over time. The main question here is that the main unknown here is we don't know the stockpiles that Russia had, and that will basically predetermine how quickly that export controls will kick in for the defense sector.
Okay, thank you. Very, very informative answers indeed. Now I will ask Mr. Kirkegaard, what are your thoughts how to follow the success of this sanction regime? Just before we discussed how some people have made mistakes or by just maybe looking at the ruble exchange rate or current account surplus of Russia and saying that sanctions do not work, but there are different indicators. Which are the ones as expert you would follow most, and how do you see them to develop in near future?
No, well, thank you for that question. No, I mean, I think, first of all, we should be honest about what financial sanctions and economic sanctions can achieve against a dictatorship that decides to wage war. Historically, it hasn't deterred it. I mean, UN carpet sanctions on Saddam Hussein in 1990 didn't cause the Iraqis to pull out of Kuwait, obviously. So we need to be realistic. But having said that, I certainly believe that we're seeing the way these technology sanctions are very directly impacting the ability of Russia to wage war. I mean, there's a reason why they need to source weapons in another sanctioned dictatorship in Iran and not in China and elsewhere. I think it clearly affects it. So I would say that by and large, the technology sanctions directly impacting the war effort, I think they have been generally pretty effective. We have managed to degrade Russia's ability to wage the kind of war that they perhaps would have liked. On the economic side, again, I mean, it was already mentioned by the Vice President, a country that suffers a 90% decline in car production. In such a country, it doesn't matter, quite frankly, that the current account surplus is up, because it clearly suggests that Russia is incapable of channeling this windfall that it has clearly achieved by also instrumentally weaponizing gas and global oil markets to useful production capacity in the real Russian economy. Basically, they cannot buy what they need for the war, or for that matter, buy what they need to have a normally functioning real economy in Russia. So again, I would say the economic sanctions have achieved largely what you could realistically expect from them at this point. And I guess I would add one component which is actually new in this round of sanctions that we haven't seen historically to the same extent, namely the voluntary withdrawal of the large parts of the private sector from Russia. We should not underestimate what the long-term implications of withdrawals of the vast number of Western companies from Russia, from the Russian economy, will mean for the long-term production capability of the Russian economy. It is a major blow. I mean, the classical example that I like to always use is we already talked about the aviation sector, right, which clearly has been very adversely affected by the sanctions. But Russian railways, what is going to degrade the Russian railway stock more than anything else? It isn't actually the sanctions as decided by the G7. It's the voluntary withdrawal of the Swedish company SKF from the Russian market, which means that there's going to be, indeed there already is by a lot of indicators, a massive shortage of ball bearings, which obviously is pretty important when you have a large railway stock. So again, this, I think, is an indication of very significantly and very effective economic sanctions that ultimately, in my opinion, is going to lead to the inability of Russia to be able to reconstitute itself as a major conventional military power even when these sanctions are eventually lifted.
Okay, thank you. And now I will ask Mrs. Palacio, how do you think from your very great background in international politics, how do you think those countries that are currently aligned against the aggressor in this economic war, how they will proceed in the future? Is there political will? Does it differ in different countries, Southern Europe, Northern Europe, United States? What's your view on that?
Thank you. Thank you. And first of all, let me say that I'm so honored to be here today. It's truly me coming from the South. I'm Spanish. Being here where things are happening is, as I say, is a great pleasure as well. Now, what you asked me, I could stop saying, I agree. I agree with the Vice President. I agree with the expert. I agree with Mr. Jacobs. And that's it, because we all see this in a very similar way. But in order to add from a broader perspective, I think that sanctions is a phenomenal theater of operations. And I'm looking at the military data here. It's because it's where we see how today geopolitics has impacted the geoeconomy. This is an extraordinary example, probably the most important one, and there are others in all, and it has been mentioned that in the restrictions on the trade with China, etc. But allow me to really insist on this idea, because there is another issue which is linked, is that geopolitics conveys values today. And sanctions is a great example. And from there, I will just jump in another. I congratulate the European Commission. I think the European Commission has been beyond the expectation of, at least my expectation. I could never imagine that with the treaty that we have, the European Commission would take the measures that the European Commission has taken. I mean, honestly, the coverage to freeze the assets of the Russian bank is quite flimsy, the coverage in the treaty. But there was political will. There was a conviction that it had to be done. And I think that for us Europeans, this is great news. And it's great news again, and this morning Colinda was explaining this, that, you know, seen from the south, in Spain or in Italy, the image that we had of Russia was little more than Tchaikovsky and Dr. Zhivago. And yes, the backlash of the sanctions are all over the European Union. And yes, and this is something that we have to remind many times to our American friends when they say, oh, we are putting this money, we are putting, yes, but you know what? The sanctions impact principally us, European Union, and we are there, and we are united. Allow me to say one last issue, or maybe one last, and then on these restrictions to trade. The issue here, I think it's fundamental, because Vladimir Putin thinks that the weak link is not military, that the weak link is the fatigue that the countries with different traditions, and I will speak about my own, Spain, my own Spain, that, by the way, has 600 just military today as part of NATO in Latvia, and another contingent of 84 with the most advanced missiles and radars. So this is, but seen from the Kremlin, the idea is that there will be a fatigue. And this is where this conference is extremely important, to highlight how being united on this common endeavor is fundamental. Now, let me say just one word about opening up the prism on restrictions, on trade restrictions. I will take as an example not just the screening that the European Commission has set without, honestly, without a very big coverage on that as well, but again, to all those gloom and doom sayers, when there is a political will, there is a way. We don't have to just say, oh, if we don't change the treaty, we have to change the treaty, we have to, okay, well, it would be good to be able to address the treaty, but in the meantime, COVID has proven it, but especially I would say more than COVID, because COVID was symmetrical, it was a different story. But more than COVID, what the European Commission is doing, and the solidarity, I mean, more than solidarity, the common approach of the Europeans is phenomenal. Now, I said at the beginning that, in my opinion, this is a fantastic, round table, and I'm very happy to participate in it, although I'm not an economist. But why? It's because what we are seeing in sanctions is scalable. The approach to trade that the United States has shown in the CHIPS Act, in the restrictions to semiconductors, is exactly values-based, So let's reflect on this idea that, okay, this morning Carl Bildt was saying, the West is back, and the West is back on resilience, on values. You know what? Absolutely yes. And there are difficulties, and we are in a difficult economic situation, but we have to keep that message.
Thank you for your very strong and inspiring words. It perhaps it shows that people here in Baltics have historically, for historical reasons, somewhat greater trust in Northern European countries, especially also England, Anglosphere, largely perhaps because of history. England, UK was helping a lot for Latvia to gain independence, but yes, this very strong support for from the European South maybe will change the perspective here. You also mentioned that European Commission has been very, very strong leader in this situation, leading European countries in support of Ukraine. My pet theory why is this so is that Latvians are running the EU. Our friend Valdis Dombrovskis is arguably the most influential vice president of the European Commission, definitely very, very visible in global media, and Latvian Ilze Johansson is running European EC civil service, right? As Latvians are running the EU, there's no wonder that the European Union has been a very strong supporter of Ukraine in this situation. But perhaps it's not also easy, and there are maybe some political risks. Mr. Dombrovskis, do you see that this rather strong will, unity maybe, except in few instances, countries like Hungary, do you think it can continue? What are your feelings, predictions about that?
Yeah, well, as much as I would like to agree with you that Latvians are running the EU, at the end of the day, to decide sanctions, it requires unanimity. So we need to have everyone on board, and so far everyone is on board. Obviously, those discussions on sanctions are not simple, especially it was visible, for example, when a 6 sanctions package we were discussing oil embargo, and you already referred to the position of Hungary in context of this sanctions package. But at the end of the day, we were able to agree on solutions and to move forward. So what is important is indeed to preserve this unity, to preserve this sense of mobilization vis-a-vis ongoing Russia's aggression. And I would say, so far, we see this political will across the EU to respond, and also we see this understanding. We are not dealing here with a regional conflict somewhere on the sides of EU. Here we are dealing with a clash of so to say, 2 world views, with authoritarian Russia invading and trying to subvert democratic Ukraine. So it's also will have far-reaching global implications in whether we will be able to preserve rules-based international order, or there is going to be some kind of might is right kind of approach.
Okay, yes, that is indeed very important. So, question to Dr. Maria Shagina. Do you see that strong political will to continue these sanctions, maybe to extend them? Will it continue also outside the European continent? Of course, in this global West, Europe is the important part, but of course also United States. Japan is also now it's actually in the East, but politically it's part of the global West. Do you see political will also in these parts of the world to continue?
Indeed, multilateral sanctions coalitions that happen this time are unprecedented. And it's not just sending the right message about norms and values, but it's actually been instrumental in terms of freezing central bank's reserves. The fact that Japan joined actually allowed us to freeze about twice as much as the UK did. And that's something that the Russian elites didn't see. That was the first shock effect for the Kremlin, that the fact that the Europeans and the Japanese joined on the central bank's assets was, I would say, the most powerful, the most shocking sanctions measure up till now. It is true that, as was pointed out by the previous speaker, resilience and security are now the key buzzwords when it comes to anything that is critically important, infrastructure, energy in particular. So that keeping that multilateral sanctions coalition is really instrumental, and we've seen it with export controls, as I pointed out earlier. The fact that the US and 37 countries join it, including Taiwan is another Asian country here, is really crucial for constraining Russia's access, curtailing access to semiconductors. Russia doesn't have any self-sufficiency in that, so it usually outsources production to Taiwan. So the fact that Taiwan joined is really important. Other countries in Asia, worth pointing out, is Singapore is another country that usually never joins any non-UN sanctions. So there is a shift there, understanding that value-driven coalitions are important, and there are more values attached to it. Either it's human rights or green values or territorial sovereignty. So gathering these coalitions will be important. I guess looking forward here is whether we will be as successful with gathering these coalitions when it comes to China, because attracting these Southeast Asian countries that are much more embedded into the Chinese economy will be a big problem, I guess, how to make them on board on the right side. Having said that, we still see quite a lot of backlash from the global south. The unintended consequences that have been partially triggered by sanctions, food and energy prices, are not landing well in countries like India, Sri Lanka. So we talked about European burden sharing, energy solidarity, but also there is a need to have that transatlantic or more global burden sharing to alleviate burden for these countries, for emerging economies who can't keep up with food prices rising, energy prices rising. So it's really important to keep also these more vulnerable economies on the right side of history.
Thank you. Jakob, yes.
Yeah, I mean, I guess on that point, you know, the support for sanctions outside the West or the broader West or whatever you choose to call it, I mean, from a technology point of view, I don't think it matters, is the short answer. I mean, it was already mentioned by Maria that all the main chip producing centers in the world, Taiwan, South Korea, etc., with the exception of China, is part of the sanctions. And what we interestingly have seen, of course, is that the threat of secondary sanctions have clearly deterred also Chinese producers from supplying Russia. So, you know, from that perspective, it doesn't matter. On the energy sanctions, we should actually be happy that the rest of the world hasn't joined in. Because if you were in a world where the total Russian global gas and oil supply had been withdrawn from the market, I guarantee you that gas and oil prices wouldn't be where they are now, they'd be much higher. And we should welcome the fact that we should be happy that the Chinese buy a lot of Russian oil. Why? Because no one squeezes Russia harder on price than the Chinese. It also, by the way, means that, with all respect to the Vice President and anybody else who works on this issue at the G7, that the G7 oil price cap almost certainly will not work. Because it is premised, and I say this as an economist, it's premised on the idea that Vladimir Putin is a rational economic actor, that he would still continue to sell if it's just a little bit above the marginal cost of production in Russia. He won't. He will simply refuse to sell any oil that is subject to the cap, and it is withdrawn, therefore, from the market. What does that mean? It means prices go up globally. That's not what the Biden administration would want, but unfortunately, this whole idea of a G7 price cap, the way they have ultimately tried to implement it, not through the use of US secondary sanctions, but by this sort of voluntary adoption, is essentially a political stunt ahead of the midterms. That has obviously failed because of the OPEC plus cuts, but that's an aside. Thank you.
Oh,
Well, I mean,
yeah, please.
may I jump in? Because, again, I think that what is beyond what you can do, you can analyze, but say it's better or worse that China buys is beyond our reach. And I would like to take a different angle, which is what the Vice President has mentioned, which is this idea of the rules-based order. Because let's not forget that for Russia, the medium is Ukraine, but what in all the speeches Vladimir Putin is against this rules-based order. And by the way, on that, he's seconded by China. So if we understand the importance of the rules-based order and that in the end this battle is about the rules-based order, we in the European Union, you know what, we are the standard bearers because we want to be a regulatory power. So we exist by law and in law, that's it. United States, honestly, this is the ambivalent actor, as in so many areas. I mean, I don't have to prove my Atlanticist credentials, but that's the truth of the matter. Then we really have Russia, which is the disruptive power. And China, we could call it the smooth operator, because China has benefited from this rules-based order more than anyone. But yet, he plays their own system with the Belt and Road and with the institutions like the infrastructure, the Asian Infrastructure Bank, that is a copycat of the World Bank, but by China. And then we have the ones that have abstained, which have the potential. Right now, you address Brazil, you address, Africa, you address not just Brazil, but the rest of Latin America, many countries. They say, you know what, this is your stuff. We have nothing to win and nothing to lose, so we abstain. And our big challenge is to make them understand, and in some issues they have understood, is that this is about them, and that they have, they have an interest in supporting this idea, the idea of the rules-based order. Why do I say that? Because remember the voting on territorial integrity. This was not unanimous, but almost. Why? Because territorial integrity, they understand. What is the challenge for us? Is that honestly, we have, I would say, abused this rules-based order. That's the truth. We have to, and we need to translate this rules-based order in issues that are directly interesting for the rest of the world. And I think this example of territorial integrity is fundamental. And then use our tools. On this I will criticize, I will not praise the European Commission because I think we could do much more in how we address what we, in a nominalism that is complicated to support, we call it the partnerships relations. No, we do a lot, but we don't take a direct approach, and we should.
Yeah, I just wanted to come back to this point which was raised on increase of food prices, also energy, but let's stick with this point of food. Because that's indeed the narrative which Russia is actively pushing, that it's Western sanctions which are responsible for growing food prices. And I think we should be very forceful in debunking this Russian fake news. Because it's clear it's Russia's war which is creating increase in food and energy prices and not our sanctions. Because if you look at food, there are no Western sanctions on food. There are no Western sanctions on transportation of Russian foodstuffs to wherever. So what is causing increases in food prices is the fact that Russia is blocking Ukrainian food exports, the fact that it's looting Ukrainian food storages in occupied territories, that it's destroying food storages in other parts of Ukraine, that it did not allow for neither normal sowing nor harvesting season in Ukraine. Those are the actions which lead to globally high food prices, because Ukraine is one of the biggest exporters of grain internationally. So what we are doing in this regard, as you know, there was a UN-led effort on unblocking Ukraine Black Sea ports, allowing for some shipments, but in parallel we were developing what we call EU solidarity lines, so creating alternative export and transit routes for Ukraine to deliver its grain, to deliver its other foodstuffs to the world via the EU. And we continue to build up this capacity, because we never know how the situation with Black Sea ports in Ukraine will develop. And already in the spring, we took a set of measures addressing global food security issues, both providing support for vulnerable countries and also looking what we can do as a EU, which we are also major exporters of foodstuffs, from the supply side, how we can increase our supply by lifting temporarily some restrictions, increasing arable territory. So I think we should be very clear and very forceful in debunking this Russia's lies about us causing increases in food prices, because that's indeed how Russia is trying to split the global West, global South away from us.
Yes, I would add that your mentioned measures to protect the global food market have perhaps worked pretty well, as global food prices have declined already for maybe half a year. But now I would again like to give word to Maria, and there is a very interesting question from the audience that maybe she could answer best among us because of her background. What is the post-war economic relationship with Russia? Can there be a return to normal? Perhaps the answer partly depends what will happen with Russia first. Does it become a big Donbass where violence becomes just endemic and totally arbitrary? Or is there, I'm almost joking, but Navalny is the president of Russia, or maybe there's deep decentralization. There is a whole big discussion about these matters too, but maybe you can elaborate on that question. What will happen after the war, whenever it ends?
I think it depends on how the war in Ukraine ends. That is key. And that actually links us to sanctions as well. While we have an objective of sanctions, there is no end game of the sanctions regime, because there is no fundamental agreement on whether the allies want to achieve a ceasefire, a negotiated settlement, or Russia's military defeat. From the US, we hear it should be some sort of strategic failure, and that's really hard to grasp, to define, and to bring everyone on board. So that will ultimately be the type of sanctions, the type of Western strategy that is now directed towards Russia is not necessarily in line with everyone. So within Europe, we have different understanding whether European security should be with Russia or without Russia for the time being when Russia is transformed. And that question, when it will be transformed and how, is again a big unknown here. Because if this is something, the strategy is directed towards avoiding humiliation and not obviously provoking any nuclear responses, that, escalation element is really a constraint for some countries not to deliver weapons or not to impose other type of sanctions. So that is the very muddled waters that we're currently in, because there is no end game. But I think what the war has shown is that Ukraine has gained so much agency, and that is shaping, the relationship between the West and Russia, and type of weapons, type of sanctions and actions overall, the West has been inspired by Ukrainian resilience and defiance, and that has actually shaped how the things are currently ongoing. In terms of internal Russia's transformation, again, that links us to sanctions in a way. We have talked mostly about economic damage that sanctions have unleashed, but whether we can translate it into any political efficacy is, again, that bridge that is very hard to cross. Paradoxically, that is what is called the naive theory of sanctions, because there is no straight line to transform, to translate that economic damage into political splits and into political impacts within the Russian elite. So what we are seeing, which is quite unusual from 2014 situation, that there have been some cracks within the Russian elites. The recent Ukraine's counteroffensive has actually brought a different type of opponents to the Kremlin's policy, and that's pro-war groups. We've seen Ramzan Kadyrov, other warlords who are opposing that the war is not effective. How much of that cracks will deepen and will penetrate within is probably, I don't want you to say that this is very promising direction to go, but they are the ones to watch in the months to come.
Yes, you mentioned the word that I think is very, very important, the word endgame. I think that the world will think about it more and more. And of course, this word gives strength to go on. So maybe I could also ask panelists present here physically, what is your idea of the endgame? Do sanctions force Russia to stop war? Do sanctions make Russia so weak that it loses war? Or also do sanctions make Russia so weak also economically that it just becomes irrelevant, so its oil is replaced after a while, and so on, so on, so on? Yes, Anna, please.
First, one comment on this idea of can there be a return to normal? What do we call normal? And I will not take the easy way of Germany bashing for its dependence on energy in Russia. It's also true for Italy, for instance. And honestly, I spoke about Spain. In Spain, we could have been as dependent as other countries were on Russia, on Algeria. Algeria was happy to sell us. However, in Spain, we decided to have a fleet of LNG terminals, precisely not to depend. I think that we have to extend this to certain raw materials, certain rare earths on which we depend. We have depended on Russia because, as a great friend of mine and great European would tell me, who could predict that it had been so reliable, even during the Cold War? Well, you know what? we know. I mean, we know now. Now, on the end game, honestly, I think that we have to be respectful that the ones that are dying are Ukrainians, and not start just deciding when, yes, we are contributing, but they are dying. Let's wait and discuss with them before going and establishing endgame scenario. That's my approach. Do you allow me one comment on another topic that,
sure.
Which is food security? And this I tell my Latvian friends. We in the South, we didn't get Russia, but there is a need to get the Mediterranean. In the Mediterranean, in the southern border of the Mediterranean, the Sahel, of course, we have a security issue, and this is the reason that supports NATO 360, but we also have famine that is coming, and this will destabilize. And there, frankly, the European Commission, hey, you know, the other day, one representative of the European Commission was praising the goodness of Green Deal for Africa. I mean, in Africa, the first thing that you have to do is not Green Deal, is to bring fertilizers, just to have in Africa, we have about 1/10 of the average fertilizers use. So we have to be realistic. We have to be values-based, but we have to be realistic. And this now partnership policy is frankly lacking realism, in my opinion, absolutely.
Okay, yes, Jakob.
I mean, I just think it's important to recognize that I mean, the question says post-war economic relationship with Russia. When it comes to sanctions, it's not going to be the end of the war that's going to decide when these sanctions are lifted. It's the answer to the question, what happens in Russia when Ukraine wins the war? Because does anybody in this room really believe that the economic sanctions will be lifted on Russia just because the war is over? Are we going to lift economic sanctions on a war criminal? Especially a war criminal when we will discover what will have gone on in Kherson, what has gone on in Mariupol, etc. I will take a lot of money on that, but that's not going to happen. So the economic relationship with Russia will remain on ice. I mean, physically. I mean, Finland is busy building a physical border fence. That will happen across, you know. This will not end. This will only end when the political system in Russia changes, which is certainly above my pay grade to you know, opine on. So we should sanctions is about Putin now. It's not about the war. Given the way that Russia has conducted the war. If you will just allow me to answer the final question here, because I think it's a common misunderstanding in some ways. The question is, how should the incoming recession be priced into the economic aspects of the Russian invasion in Ukraine? I think on a global level, there's no doubt that the global economy is slowing down. But I think it's also, we should be honest and say that this war is a regional war in Europe. It is not the Russian invasion of Ukraine that will likely cause a recession in the United States. And the recession in the United States is driven by the long-term lingering effects of the failed response to COVID, long COVID in the workforce, etc., and an excessive fiscal stimulus. And now the monetary response of the Federal Reserve. It actually doesn't have very much to do with what happened in Ukraine. In China, it is driven by the end of the Chinese growth model, this investment-led growth model of building ever more high-speed railways and more real estate, etc. That's over. And it's triggered by the completely insane anti-COVID policies being pursued, of course, now by Xi Jinping. Again, it doesn't actually have very much to do with what happens in Ukraine. It is an aggravating factor, but it's not the driving factor. It is, however, probably the driving factor in Europe, where clearly the regional relative price shock of energy prices has caused the ECB to have to raise rates. It's the reason why you have 10% inflation, etc., in Europe. However, we get a recession from that, but I would say good, frankly. Because we're getting a recession in Europe driven by a price shock on fossil fuels that have turbocharged the green transition across Europe in a way that probably wouldn't have been happening otherwise. So because of this energy price shock, we're probably facing the last ever major energy crisis in Europe and indeed across the West, because it will drive over the course of the next 5 years the introduction of renewable energy, so that going forward the price of energy in Europe and indeed the West will be driven by technology, not by whatever fossil fuel producers want to do, etc. And technology will ensure that the marginal price of energy, especially electricity, goes only one way in the long run, and that is down.
Okay, yes, so we have 5 minutes left. Any super urgent questions from the audience? Yes, the first hand was there.
My name is Victoria Rusnaite. I'm from the Hybrid Theory. I have a question for Maria Shagina and Jakob Kirkegaard. And the question is about time and how long does it take for sanctions to work, and do we have this time? In your assessments, where, in what sectors or countries should sanctions focus now to strain Russia's ability to wage this war? And are there any easy gains left? And if there are no easy gains left, what options do we have? Thanks.
Okay.
I mean, I'm happy to go first, but maybe Maria should go. I mean,
Yes, okay, Maria. So, Maria, please.
That's a great question from Victoria. Nice to hear from you. I think the energy sector is the key one to focus. While we have announced energy sanctions from the EU side, oil embargo, and the price cap, we haven't implemented them. So for those who are saying sanctions are not working because Russia has accumulated so and so much, and by the end of this year, we will accumulate around $300 billion, which is ironically almost the amount of central bank's assets that have been frozen. That is partially true, but we also need to look at the design of sanctions, right? So the key aspect here, the cash cow of the Russian budget hasn't been targeted. The US, the UK have imposed that measure in March, but the Europeans, who are the main consumers of Russian fossil fuels, are about to join only in December. So it is true that in a way that type of policy, by delaying it, has contradicted the objective of sanctions, which is again to erode Russia's ability to fund the war, because we have allowed basically Russia to have 7 months to not to adapt. It will be hard to adapt to Russia, but at least to accumulate the reserves from record high oil prices. Another area to look here is also secondary sanctions, right? That is something that is still on the table. The US is rather reluctant to impose them, but the recent development from the EU, from the 8th sanctions package, is to impose sanctions on third parties who circumvent the EU sanctions. And that is, I think, an interesting move of extraterritorial nature that can maybe exploited with other allies, how to basically tighten enforcement. Because we have 8 sanctions packages, it's a lot, but what we need to focus on right now is not maybe as sexy as it sounds, and that's enforcement. To close down all of the loopholes, to tighten what is already implemented, and that's a lot of hard work, and that's sometimes hard to sell politically, but I think this is where the allies should focus on in the next months.
Okay, and thank you. And time for one more question. There is hand on that side. Yes, sir, please.
Thank you. I have a question to Valdis Dombrovskis. In previous panelists discussed much about how to finance Ukraine in given war conditions. And also speaker mentioned the frozen assets. I think last month's Justice Commissioner mentioned there are 24 billion central bank assets frozen and about 14 or more private individual entities, being frozen. And the question is, some believe this can be legally expropriated and used to finance and help Ukraine. What's your take? Do you believe in it? Thank you.
Yeah, well, as regards financing Ukraine, indeed, there are many questions. One, of course, what we are providing right now as a financing this year in terms of macrofinancial assistance, other support forms, and all in all, we have mobilized some 19 billion euros. It's EU together with EU member states and European financial institutions. And on top of this, there is also 3.1 billion euros in military support. We are now planning, so to say, to ensure stable and predictable financing flow to Ukraine next year, together with other international partners, because many of the decisions were taken on ad hoc basis this year, which led to a bit unpredictable financing flows towards Ukraine. So for next year, we can ensure it's steadier. And then there will be a question of Ukraine's post-war reconstruction, where the financing needs are huge. So the estimate of the World Bank was of 349 billion, well, euros or dollars, how you put it. But we see that damage continues by the day. So the question indeed, how this reconstruction will be financed, and there we're ready to cooperate very closely with G7, with other international financial institutions and so on. But obviously we're looking also at Russia's assets, because there is a principle in international law that aggressor pays. So Russia is due to pay reparations to Ukraine for the damage it has created. Whether Russia would do it voluntarily, I think it's a big question mark. So indeed we need to look on currently frozen and seized assets, how these can indeed be confiscated and used also to support Ukraine's reconstruction.
Yes, and very, very briefly.
No, I mean, just very quickly on that very point, we just published recently a report from the German Marshall Fund on this very issue. And I certainly think, notwithstanding what the Vice President just said about European commitments, they need to be stepped up. I mean, if Europe wants a strategic leadership of reconstruction of Ukraine, there needs to be a lot more money on the table. That also, in my opinion, there needs to be common European financial instruments on the table. And what that means is that a lot of the traditional, quote-unquote, frugal countries, including here in Latvia, including in the Baltic countries, that traditionally oppose common fiscal policy, common fiscal European instruments, are going to have to make a decision. Are we with Ukraine in the long run, also in the financial sense, or are we just going to remain frugal and sit on the sidelines? And that is a question that's going to be answered here in Riga and many other, quote-unquote, frugal capitals.
One sentence. One sentence. I agree with both of you, but I think that we, especially to our American friends, we have to explain to them, because they are, as always, overwhelming. No, I mean, I think that the European Union is contributing. I fully agree, especially that we need to have specific instruments. And we have to address how we change the enlargement, which brings us to another big hornet's nest. But we need. Ukraine has put us against the wall. We cannot just go on procrastinating, just dragging feet on the enlargement. We have to decide, and probably to decide again on realistic terms. And it will not be 35 chapters and then it's a membership. Probably it will be much more pragmatic, and what the Commission has done with the treaty. We cannot just obsess ourselves with changing the treaty. With the treaty, we have to do it. But again, in the international with this approach of international led by the Americans, we have to stand our position.
Yes. So it's a great discussion. I would like to continue, but it's 5:03. The subject is very complicated, but discussion is very smooth and sometimes even slightly entertaining. So thank you, distinguished panelists. Thank you, dear audience. And
thanks, Chris.